Good evening, friends. Thank you all for joining us today evening for the first Professor Amitava Bose Memorial Lecture under the aegis of ABLEAF at IIM Calcutta. And we are honored to have Professor Debraj Ray, who kindly agreed on a very, very short notice to join us today to deliver the talk. I would request Professor Somen Sikdar to formally welcome Professor Ray with a bouquet.
This is a photo of Debraj. This is good Calcutta tradition.
We also have today, and we are happy that Professor Bose's family, Mrs. Tapati Bose, Mr. Abhishek Bose and other family members have also joined us. I would request Professor Leela Chatterjee to welcome them on our behalf.
Tapati is there. Leela, you go up upstairs.
Okay, I'll just give it to Tapati. Yep. It's such an honor to be here.
Professor Amitava Bose, who was a member of faculty in the economics group and later also served as director of the institute from 1997 to 2002. He was a multifaceted personality with Renaissance sensibilities. Born on 28th July 1947, Professor Bose was schooled at Calcutta Boys School and Doon School, Dehradun. He read economics for his undergraduate degree at Presidency College of the University of Calcutta and for his masters in the same subject at Delhi School of Economics of the University of Delhi. At Delhi School, from where he graduated in 1969 as first rank holder, he was taught amongst others by Jagdish Bhagwati, Sukhamoy Chakrabarti and Amartya Sen. Subsequently, he joined the University of Rochester for his doctoral research, graduating in 1974. His stay in Rochester was contemporaneous with a stellar bunch of graduate students from India: Anjan Mukherjee, Satish Jain, Dipankar Das Gupta, Tapan Mitra, Partho Chatterjee, Farouk Malik, Alok Ray, among others, all of whom were to go on and make a mark in the world of academics. They were to become lifelong friends and in some instances academic collaborators. And among them, and in their company, Amitava shone. He joined IIM Calcutta in 1974 as assistant professor. Professor Seth, our director, would talk more about his journey at IIM Calcutta. In 74, when Professor Bose returned from Rochester, he joined IIM Calcutta as assistant professor, and in those days, Calcutta was an exciting hub of research in theoretical economics. Professor Bose joined an outstanding group led by Ajit Biswas and included among others Amiyo Bagchi, Sanjit Bose, Farouk Malik and Dipankar Das Gupta that met regularly to discuss Ricardo and Sraffa in a general equilibrium context. In the early 1980s, another group led by Mihir Rakshit and included Professor Bose, Dipankar Das Gupta, Dipankar Kundu, Pradeep Maiti, Anup Sinha and Somen Sikdar worked on macroeconomics of developing economies like India, taking forward Kalakian demand constraints model. This led to the famous two-sector models with agriculture being supply constraint and non-agricultural demand constraint. Out of the work of this group emerged a volume called Studies in the Macroeconomics of Developing Countries, edited by Mihir Rakshit and published in 1989, which at the time was path-breaking. In this volume, Professor Bose contributed a paper titled Short Period Equilibrium in a Less Developed Economy, where he both critiqued and took forward the work of V.K.R.V. Rao and Michael Kalaki, which remains one of the finest expositions of the dynamics of a two-sector model. Even today, it remains an excellent place to start when one thinks about macroeconomics of developing economies. Professor Bose's penchant for thinking in a general equilibrium context, which reflects in this paper, is a legacy of his engagement with the earlier group led by Professor Viswas. If Professor Bose was an accomplished and deep-thinking macroeconomist, his grasp over microeconomics was no less thorough, and he used to teach courses on theory of the firm and general equilibrium theory outside of introductory and advanced macroeconomics. It was because he was so comfortable in macro as well as microeconomics, so thoughtful and catholic as a reader, that he was called by contemporaries an economist's economist, and his opinion widely sought and respected. And it was this clarity and catholicity of thought and understanding that made him an outstanding teacher. For legions of students, being taught by Professor Bose was both an enlightening and memorable experience, something they cherished long after they left the classrooms and corridors of IIM Calcutta. If Professor Bose was an economist of the first water, he also was an effective leader. He assumed the reins of directorship immediately after the institute was undergoing trying times in a post-liberalization policy regime. He took the faculty along, made us move beyond the narrow tribal loyalties, and pointed out that when we play to our strength, the world is our oyster. His directorship therefore laid the foundation for the expansion and growth that followed, and the change in orientation as India globalized. He inspired colleagues to walk the extra mile, defended them when they took initiative, but also held them accountable. But the buck always stopped with him, both as an economist and as a leader. He was a role model. It is not only as an economist and leader that we remember Amitava, however. He was deeply interested in literature, both Bangla and English, music, cinema, cricket, food, just to name some of his varied interests. He could have an informed conversation about Bertolucci, Bergman, Ray and Ghatak just as easily as well he could about Keynes, Minsky and Walras. He could discuss the technical aspects of Vivian Richards' square cut or the relative strength of Saurav Ganguly and Sachin Tendulkar. He could go toe-to-toe discussing Kolkata's hundreds of varieties of sandeshes and their relative merits. Or where you might get a decent steak in Kolkata, with a huge sense of sartorial elegance, he was equally at home in a traditional dhoti Punjabi which he occasionally wore to work, as in a suit and tie. With an impish sense of humor, he never wore his erudition on his sleeve. As a result, he always included and rarely excluded. A proud Bengali, he was a true blue cosmopolitan as well, and it was this ability to straddle many worlds which made him so different. We surely do miss him, and for so many different reasons. Which is why we are extremely grateful to late Professor Bose's family for endowing such a generous grant that has made possible the setting up at IIM Calcutta of the Amitava Bose Lab for Economic Analysis and Policy to celebrate his contributions to economics and management education. This inaugural lecture is ABLEAD's first public activity, and we are also grateful for the continued support of late Professor Bose's family in helping to bring this day to fruition. I would now request Professor Anju Seth to introduce our speaker of the day and share her thoughts about Professor Bose.
Thank you so much, Professor Mishra.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed my pleasure and honor to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Debraj Ray. We are truly honored to have him here with us today and thank him for accepting our invitation to deliver the first Amitava Bose Memorial Lecture this evening. Professor Ray is the Julius Silver Professor in the Faculty of Arts and Science and Professor of Economics at New York University, a distinguished scholar in the field of microeconomic theory, development economics and game theory. He has a doctorate from Cornell University and has taught development economics at both the undergraduate and doctoral levels since 1982. Institutions that he has graced with his presence include Stanford, the Indian Statistical Institute, right here in Calcutta, Boston University, Harvard, Columbia, the University of Warwick, and NYU. Subjects that he has taught are economic dynamics, game theory, industrial organization, real analysis, intermediate microeconomics, and many more. Amongst many of his recognitions and honors, the most recent are the Golden Teaching Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching at NYU. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2016. He has a degree in philosophy, the honors in philosophy from the University of Oslo. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. And he is a fellow of the Society for the Advancement of Economic Theory in 2011. He is also board member in the Bureau for Research in the Economic Analysis of Development since its inception, and currently co-editor of American Economic Review. So he has been hard at work on his editorial duties today. In addition, he has served, or currently serving, on the editorial boards of AJ Microeconomics, the Journal of Economic Theory, Gains in Economic Behavior, Journal of Development Economics, Economic Theory, Journal of Economic Growth, Review of Development Economics, Japanese Economic Review, Journal of Economic Inequality, Econometrica, and Economic Bulletin. It is our great privilege and honor to have you amongst us today at IIM Calcutta to deliver the first lecture, the first Amitava Bose Memorial Lecture. This event is being held under the aegis of the Amitava Bose Lab for Economic Analysis of Policy at IIM Calcutta, with Professor Mishra introduced to you. I would like to take this opportunity to once again thank the family of late Professor Amitava Bose, who was one of our own at IIM Calcutta, for the most generous endowment to make possible this lab and all the activities that it supports. Strongly recommended by Amartya Sen after having graduated from Rochester, Professor Bose joined IIM Calcutta as an assistant professor in 1974, becoming professor 6 years later in 1980. Even though he taught and lectured in many institutions, including IIM Calcutta, Presidency College, now University, Calcutta University, Cornell University, and JNU, he really was to spend the rest of his working life at IIM Calcutta, where he became director from June 1997 to September 2002. After finishing his term as director, he rejoined the faculty until his retirement. A leading name in the field of economics, his work as a teacher and thought leader have inspired many generations of IIM Calcutta students and consequently large numbers of younger academics as well. An accomplished academic, he applied his brilliance unremittingly to the economic problems of developing countries for over 40 years. Many students who graduated from IIM Calcutta, including myself, owe Professor Bose a great debt of gratitude. He always set high academic standards and expected the same from the students. And from my experience, I can vouch, his students responded in a similar vein. Dr. Mishra was talking about his interest in the theory of the firm. I really think that my own interest in the theory of the firm, which is something that I carry with me till today, it was born at that time in conversations that I had with him at the time. So Professor Bose was an outstanding teacher, an exemplary human being, and also a very nurturing leader. On behalf of IIM Calcutta, and on my own and my personal behalf, once again, I would like to express our debt of gratitude to the family of late Professor Bose, his wife, Mrs. Tapati Bose, his son and daughter-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Abhishek Bose, who are here with us in the audience, for endowing the Institute with resources to set up a lab in his memory and keep the tradition of academic excellence and scholarship, which truly reflects the legacy of Professor Bose going forward. May I now invite Professor Debraj Ray to deliver the first Amitava Bose Memorial Lecture.
let's do it then. Is this working?
Not yet. Where is
Not yet.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Am I clear? Usually I'm not very clear. I just want to thank everybody here, the director, of course, for that wonderful introduction to Amitava. I'm really moved. I was just sitting here and just thinking. I just had images of Amitava in my mind as I was listening. And I'm so glad that his entire family is here, Bodhi is here. And I'm deeply honored and grateful to be able to give this lecture in his memory. So this is the picture I took of Bodhi and Amitava some years ago, which I treasure. And as you look at the picture, I'll just tell you how I first met him. I was 17 years old. I was a student at Presidency College. And somebody, I don't remember who, had come to give a lecture. And near the end of the lecture, it was time for questions, and being very brash and overconfident like a whole bunch of my presidency batch, I asked a completely idiotic question, to which the lecturer tried to be reasonably nice to me, but there was not much headway he could make with the question because it was somewhat stupid. Upon which a young man, well, young from my perspective now, about a few years older than me, he said very quietly, let me try to rephrase Debraj's question in another way. And then ended up asking an extremely erudite version of my question, which actually had very little to do with my original query, right? So that was Amitava for the first time. When I met him, he was essentially trying to put me at ease. That's at least the feeling that I got at the time, and I verified this with him some years later, and indeed, in his very quiet and shy way, he just smiled a little bit and had no more to say on the subject. The next time I met Amitava was in 1988. Many years had passed. I had just come back from Stanford. I was teaching at ISI, and Amitava had come to visit. And he was working on a paper, which is, for Amitava, if you know him, a very unusual enterprise. Because like all economists, of which there are very few, I should add, Amitava would only work on a paper if pushed to it. He had all his ideas laid out very clearly in his mind, and then if somebody would cajole him into writing something for a book, he would do it. But if you look at his CV, you won't find many papers in it. And yet, he had what I consider to be the finest mind, along with Kapil Mitra, of that generation of economists that I had the good fortune to interact with. He was like a brother to me, he was a mentor, he was of course a friend. We used to go out drinking together whenever I would come to Calcutta. He would always give me advice, never unsolicited, always whenever I asked for it, otherwise he would keep his hands off. He would always ask very interesting questions, as was just pointed out, about all sorts of things. It didn't have to be economics, but we did economics as well together. So this is a picture of me and Amitava, probably at around the same visit. And this, I am very proud to report, is probably the only refereed paper that he very kindly agreed to write. And this was after I had cajoled him right here on the grounds of the IIM. For a couple of years we worked together, and then we came out with this paper that I'm very proud of. Probably the only refereed paper of Amitava Bose. He could have published many other refereed papers, far better than this, but this is probably the only one that I know of, and this came out in 1993. So that's a brief account of my interactions with Amitava. all of you know him as a great intellect, and as somebody who really had insights into the subject of economics. But maybe what is rather less known is how he was so nurturing to somebody very young, and literally brought them up without them knowing it, brought them up intellectually. And I was certainly one of them. So this is my short tribute to Amitava. Now, the topic that I want to talk about today was actually born from discussions with Amitava. I worried a lot about what I should present. Should I present something in a lot of generality, without recourse to any technicalities of any kind, or should I talk about a subject which is one of his favorites, economic growth? But then I thought that that would be possibly too technical for a general audience. Not that you would not understand. It's just that it would be maybe more boring than the occasion demands. So I decided on something in between, and which is the title of this talk on aspirations and inequality. So what follows, as I said, is related to topics that Amitava and I have often discussed. So, Showman, you will tell me how long I can speak for.
45 minutes.
45 minutes? Okay. I'll try and keep it. So, these are numbers I think you might find interesting. Try to guess what they are. Amitava and I actually worked out a couple of them. These numbers are the doubling times that it took for leading countries in the world to double their per capita income. Okay? So the world leader, many centuries ago with the Netherlands, it would double its per capita income once every 350 years. And then if you work down that list, you go to, let's say, the United States, which is the usual 2% rate of growth, doubling every 35 years or so, and then the Latin American countries, and then obviously culminating in countries such as Korea, South Korea, India, and China, and China, of course, not recently, but at least until very recently, was doubling its per capita income every 7 to 9 years. Now, this is an extraordinary change, right? If you look at the Industrial Revolution, it's up there. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, the doubling time for the United Kingdom was 150 years. So we are talking about an extraordinary change that has taken place, not just in the levels of development, but in the rate of change of development. Yeah. And I kind of find that very interesting for the following reason, that to that treadmill, which is always tilting upwards, you can add on uneven growth, right? Structural transformation from agriculture to industry, of course, but then all the other great structural transformations that have taken place. Globalization, and therefore the move towards specialization, technical progress, which has also sent entire industries into upheaval. Right? So if you put all of these together, it is very hard to imagine that our preferences in the face of the onslaught of all these changes would just remain fixed and immutable. So the idea that I want to talk about in this paper is the notion of aspirations, which is that individual preferences fundamentally depend on the lives of others, on what they see around them, on the goals that they set for themselves, but those goals are social goals and not private goals. Now this is, I should have really come here to praise economics and not to bury it, right? It's not that I'm burying it, but I am saying that there could be other starting points that are worth exploring, and this is the one that I want to explore today. And I think, and in particular, because I'm interested so much in questions of economic inequality and conflict and so forth, I think it's absurd to think about topics like this. Of course, one could, but I think that no discussion would be complete without taking into account the fact that preferences are such socially determined in such a strong way. And what I'm going to argue is that it's unclear whether this sort of exposure to the lives of others, not that, I'm not making any normative statements, just from a positive point of view, it's unclear that this sort of exposure to the lives of others leads to a feeling of inspiration or to despair, right? It could be both. Yeah? So for example, there's this great quote about the French Revolution. It said the French found their position all the more intolerable as it grew better, right? Which of course may have something to do with the French, but I don't think so. I think it's a more general statement than just a nasty remark about the French. That sometimes our aspirations run ahead of us when our lives are changing. And perhaps, there are many examples of this, but one of the stories that I read about in Presidency College actually, that my sort of mind goes back to is this idea of Hirschman's tunnel. Okay, so Hirschman was this wonderful social scientist from Princeton, and there's this little paradigm, right, which is known as Hirschman's tunnel, which is odd because it has really nothing to do with the tunnel as far as I can tell. But in any case, this is a traffic jam, which I pulled out from Google, traffic jam in Cairo, and I want you to imagine that you're stuck in this traffic jam in one of the lanes, right? And then Hirschman says, now imagine that the lane next to you starts to move. And Hirschman's beautiful question is, does that make you feel better or worse, right? And it's a great question, right? Because of course the fact that the lane next to you is moving is a sign that things are going to clear up. So every government, every head of state has a honeymoon period, right? Where you can entertain inequalities which could not be entertained in the long run. But if that lane keeps moving, right, and your own lane doesn't move, then the very same movement will reverse your feelings towards it, right? Because, well, for obvious reasons. So what I want to do is I want to think about, this is not exactly Hirschman's tunnel, but something related. I want to talk about this notion of aspirations and social outcomes. And I want to think of these as exhibiting a two-way synergistic relationship, right, going back and forth between each other. So the first direction is that our social outcomes, as I was saying just a few minutes ago, this actually influences our aspirations, and I'll make this concept a little bit more formal in a minute, okay? But it influences how we aspire towards a better future, and that's influenced by the lives of others around us. And of course, these aspirations will then, just aspirations alone are uninteresting, okay? They would lead into certain actions, investments we take perhaps in bringing up our children better, or to make our own lives better, or perhaps other kinds of more sinister investments, okay, to which I will come presently, yeah? But we would take certain actions. Those actions, since all of us are taking them, would feed back into society, would aggregate up, and create society backwards, right? And so you have this two-way interaction, and just as we do general equilibrium with prices and demand curves, we can do general equilibrium with aspirations in society. There's nothing to stop us from doing exactly that. Okay? So what I want to submit to you, but I won't be able to talk about it in much detail, is that an entire research program can actually be built around this very simple and elementary framework. So I just put up some examples. We can use it to think about poverty traps, right? Many of you may have studied poverty traps in your development classes, but these would be aspirational traps. It goes also back to the work of the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai. We can think about the interaction between growth and inequality. We can think about mobility. We can think about how people double down when they lose some money on the stock market or when they lose a job. They take excessive risks. It's because their aspirations are still stuck up there and they're trying to head back. Yeah. We can think of how we should set goals for children in education, whether those goals should be set high or low or somewhere in between. We can think about things like the fertility transition. Yeah, whether aspirational changes might lead to a preference for quality rather than quantity in children. And as I'll talk about a little bit today, we can think about it in the context of social conflict. So, because I won't have time to talk about all of these, I'll just say a few words about how the basic framework is set up, and I'll talk a little bit about this interaction between growth and inequality, and I will tell you a little bit about social conflict. Okay, so that's what I want to do today in my talk. So here's a little bit more detail to understand the structure of this setup. Okay. So the way I want to think about it, right? By the way, if some of you are not familiar or happy with equations, you can ignore them. I'll try to go around them and say everything as clearly as words. But given this is the IIM, I think it's very unlikely anyway. Okay? So I want to think of aspirations as reference points which you use to evaluate your personal outcomes. So if you think of aspirations as some sort of vector of things, right, which I'll tell you about in a second, this depends on where you live, your own characteristics, which are given by this little y, and it's given by this distribution of characteristics of people around you. F stands for a typical distribution notation, so it's the distribution of people around you. So y is personal outcomes, and F is the social distribution over those outcomes. So a leading example where y could be your own wealth, F could be the ambient distribution of wealth in society, right? And A, in this case, would be some sort of threshold that I want my children or my future self to achieve in life, right? So that would be an example. But of course, aspirations could be multidimensional, right? There could be other things. This was just an example. There could be notions not only of income, but notions of dignity, of good health, of recognition by others. There could be a little bit more sinister, right? One could have aspirations to political power or aspirations towards domination of others on grounds of religion or ethnic grounds, right? These too are driven by aspirations, except that the word aspiration sounds like such a nice, happy, healthy word, right? That maybe one should be using another word in its place here. But in any case, one can think of aspirations as this multidimensional object. And likewise, the social influences on our aspirations could also be multidimensional, right? So for example, of course, we think of the influence of our peers or our near peers, right? On how we feel about our lives. But we could think of the underlying distribution, as in Hirschman, as sources of information, right, about what's happening. We could base them in different ways on religion, caste, and ethnicity, depending on where we are in that panorama. There could be educational goals, as the work of Ileana La Ferrara recently has so eloquently brought out. And there could be all sorts of statistical considerations. Okay? If you're a farmer thinking of adopting a new crop, you want to look at other people like you because it serves as an econometric control, right? For whether the choice of that crop would be appropriate or not. You wouldn't look to see if, I don't know, somebody else in a completely different socioeconomic sphere were using, were deliberating on that crop. So now, so far, if you look at the title of these slides, you'll see that I'm trying to go in this sequence, right? So I talked about how society might determine aspirations. Now I want to talk about how, and this is going to be the relatively novel part of this, where we come to the economics of it, how those aspirations then map into our preferences. Yeah? So I want to talk a little bit about that. So, again, a couple of equations, but I'm going to try and do it in words as cleanly as I can. Right? So I want to think of these aspirations as anchoring my sense of payoff, right, from life. So if you think of, C as my current consumption and Z as the investments I make in my children's life, right? So I want to think of this as just a very standard utility function that we all use. But then, for the future, I want to think of two kinds of ways in which future wealth enters into my feeling of achievement. Okay? One is in the completely standard way, which I put up here. There's some value function that I have over the wealth of my children. But this part is the non-standard way. And what I'm saying here in words is the following. I get an extra kick from my children's achievements, or from my future achievements, only if they lie above my going aspiration threshold. Okay? So I get that kick when I manage to cross the aspiration threshold. Okay? And then there's, of course, some feasible set that links how much I can consume and how much I can invest. Obviously, I can't do both at the same time, right? There's a frontier between the two of them, and this would be a typical maximization problem which would link one to the other, right? So all of this is very standard. What's not standard is this A, which is lurking in there, which is this aspirational threshold that's driving driving what I want. So if you like, you can think of this W0, which is very standard, as my intrinsic utility, right? The standard utility that I have. And you can think of this W1 as my aspirational utility, something that I enjoy only when my children's achievements cross a particular threshold. Now, by the way, I want to think of all these utility functions as completely standard. So none of this is going to have any kind of weird shape or slope, right? They're all going to be the usual increasing concave function. But what I want to show you is that when I put them together, that gives rise to a somewhat non-standard problem. And here's how we put them together, okay? So this is, just think of the future, forget about my current consumption, but think of, this is my intrinsic utility, and remember, this is the aspirational utility, which only kicks in when my children's wealth crosses my aspirational threshold. And since I'm adding the two of them up, when I add them, I get a blue curve which looks like that. Okay? So I get this is my intrinsic part, and the intrinsic part is still here, but it's kind of vanished because I've added on the extra aspirational kick. Now, do you have are we doing questions
Yes,
while
As you wish.
I'll wait.
As you like.
No, go ahead.
Does it matter that I don't get a reverse kick if I fall short?
No, so that's the next slide. Yeah. Thank you so much. This is the typical kind of question that you welcome, right? Okay, so yeah, so this is my reverse kick, right? As the question puts it, right? You can of course say, I feel bad if I don't meet my aspirations, in which case this curve is going to look somewhat more complicated. But everything I'm going to talk about today will translate in this more complex case. So that's why I'm looking at the simplicity. By the way, there could be several aspirational thresholds. This is when my child goes through, I don't know, my child graduates from school. This is if she graduates from college, etc., right? So I could get several aspirational kicks. Again, I'm not talking about that in detail, even though the model can be extended to analyze this. Okay, so I'm just back to the standard picture, right? I should call it a standard picture, the picture that I just introduced. And I want you to note a couple of things about aspiration, which are interesting. One is that if I were to tell you, well, the first thing is that it's never good to aspire, okay, in this sense. Because if you aspire, your aspiring threshold will move to the right, okay, and your utility is going to come down. Aspirations have never made anybody happy. However, okay, it also means that if you aspire more, you might invest more, right? But this is the very important distinction between the intrinsic nature of aspirations, okay, which is why all our history in India tells us to shun all material wants and desires, okay, because the only thing they can do is make you unhappy. But actually, your children might want their parents to aspire because they will get a larger bequest as a result of it, right? There's the instrumental role of aspiration as opposed to the intrinsic role, which is that it could prod a parent into actually pushing towards a better life for her child. Okay? So these are the two things. So high aspirations per se in this setup is always bad for happiness in the short term, but they could be good for happiness in the long term.
I mean,
Yeah.
when you say child, you mean it literally that if a person does not have a child, then he doesn't have any problem of this?
No, I'm just thinking of this as a dynamic story where I think of my future self versus my current self. I use the word child to describe my future self. Mathematically they're identical in this setup. Okay, so now I want to talk about this issue of the instrumental role of aspirations rather than the intrinsic role. Okay? And what I want to tell you is this. So what I've done is I've put my current consumption, or at least the utility from current consumption here, and I've thought of it as a cost function. You can think of if I'm pushing more towards my children, towards investing more in their children, I have to pay for that in terms of current consumption. So I put that in as a cost function over here. Just give me 1 second, let me just finish the sentence, okay? And then, now the reason for having this very simple setup will become clear, is that I want to depart from the textbook economic model where you can just write down first order conditions. But I don't want to depart from it too far, because I don't want to create horrible technicalities that will make it difficult for me to make progress on this model. So in terms of, if there are students here, I'd like to tell them, when you depart from something, do it minimally, right? So this is what I'm doing. I know you have a question, I'll come back to it. Okay? So what I'll do here in this problem is that I'll still write down first order conditions, but I'm going to check only 2 first order conditions. I need to check one up there, and I need to check one down there. Okay? And the idea is that this is not just mathematical sophistry, right? It has meaning. It says, do I invest a lot in my children, or do I give up? Okay? So this is investing a lot, and this is kind of giving up, saying my these aspirations are too high, and I can't handle them. Okay? Given the resources that I have. Yes, go ahead.
On aspiration and happiness, I was just taking the case of an entrepreneur. Maybe as the aspirations go, happiness doesn't come down.
Look, you know, I was pushing that too hard. Okay? It's completely unimportant whether the level of the utility function goes up or down. Okay? So this is a philosophical question. Is this entrepreneur who is working 18 hours a day, is the guy happy or not? God knows, right? Luckily, for economists who believe in revealed preference, it's unimportant. All we care about really is the instrumental effect. Yeah. So, you know, shifts in this utility function don't matter as long as you're maximizing it. We need to know about what the effects are on your actual behavior. So, good question, but let me hold on. Right? So this is this milestone nature of aspiration, these thresholds, right? This is what leads to the Hirschman-like tip-overs. Okay? So just to give you an idea, first, by the way, a lot of these things are predicated on the notion that your aspirations are not something that you can entirely control. Okay? Now, people do control. We always hear about people getting off the wagon, right? Or people saying, you know, I don't want to look at the world around me. I want to live, you know, in my own simple way, and people do try to do that, right? We do that when we are bringing up our children as well. We want them to aspire, but we don't want them to think that they're next Isaac Newton, right? Because they're going to be very unhappy kids, right? So we want to have some sense of how we make our children aspire. Yeah? But by and large, the story I have in mind here that I want to focus on is that these aspirations are the results of pernicious or perhaps good, I don't want to use too many, you know, derogatory or non-derogatory words, but they're the result of influences on your life, TV that you're watching, the internet, what's happening to your cousins in Norway, you know, people that you know in other parts of the world, what's happening in your neighborhood, somebody bought a new Hyundai or a Maserati or I don't know what, right? All of these have an effect on the way you are, okay, on your aspirations. So what I want to think about is this, you know, think of these aspirational thresholds moving to the right, okay? And we're going to have to close that model later on, but imagine these aspirational thresholds moving to the right. Your investment will also move to the right, but up to a point. Because when your aspirations get large enough, you are going to retreat to the lower first order condition. Okay? So, for example, if your aspirations get too pulled to the right, it's like a string snapping, right? It's like a mental string that snaps, and then back you come to a much lower level of investment. And this is the core idea, okay, that I'm trying to argue which is used in several of the applications that I won't have time to discuss today. The idea is that the same direction of movement, increasing aspirations, first has a positive instrumental effect. And then, if it's pulled too far, has a kind of snapping effect, whereby you retreat to a lower level of investment. So it's broadly speaking, if you put aspirations on some axis and you just do comparative statics, if you like, with it, right? And you put the investments that you're making on the vertical axis, and you find out how you're reacting to it, then as aspirations go up, to some degree, it's going to pull your investments up. And then there comes the snapping point. It's always discontinuous in this model, right? It will be discontinuous, and then you jump down, and then you feel a sense of frustration, okay? Again, feelings are unimportant, but in terms of observation, what you see is that there is a sudden decline in one's investment. So this is the sort of basic proposition that I wanted to kind of put forward, which is to say that for every wealth level, if I fix somebody's wealth level, there's a threshold below which aspirations are met and above which they're frustrated. But when they're met, your investment will grow with your aspirations. It has a positive instrumental effect. But when they're frustrated, your investment jumps discontinuously downwards and thereafter remains insensitive to, or they decline, your investments will decline. So in a nutshell then, I started with social outcomes. I talked about aspirations. I talked about how they map into preferences. I talked about how these preferences map into individual outcomes. And now, if you aggregate up all the individual outcomes of all the people in society, then you get to do macroeconomics, right? All this while we are doing micro. In the next slide, we do macro, right? Which is here, right? So you aggregate, and then you come back to social. Right? So this is the kind of story that I have in mind. This is the kind of overall equilibrium story, if you like, that I have. And if you combine this, you get an evolving economy. So just to give you an idea, again, I'll go very quickly through this, just in the interest of time. So you think of starting with, in my example of wealth, you think of starting with a distribution of wealth at some date, okay? And then there are people who live inside this distribution. They're influenced by this distribution. Right? Maybe not globally, maybe locally, whatever, they're influenced by this distribution. And they choose that continuation wealth, as Amitava said, for their future self, if they don't have kids, or they have kids for their kids, right? And then that tomorrow's wealth gives you a new distribution in the system of wealth, right? So what would be the story? So this is your distribution at any date, right? And all these people living in it. Here's a typical person living here, right? She has income, she has wealth Y1. She has aspirations A1, which has been created by this picture. And then there's all kinds of other people, right? So here's Y2 with A2, Y3 with A3, etc., right? Notice that here's a very complacent person right up at the top, yeah? Who has very few people ahead of him and maybe has aspirations which are below his current wealth. He's doing fine, okay? So complacency is also a possibility, right? And then all of these people are going to make investments. And they will move in that income distribution. And when they move in that income, here is, Y1 moves somewhere and Y2 moves somewhere and so forth. And then that will give you this blue line when you aggregate it all up, and that's tomorrow's distribution of wealth. And the system just continues. So I'm not going to go into detail about this, but I just want to show you a consequence of this extremely simple model, what it gives you in terms of growth and inequality. So this is a paper that I worked on with Garance Genico, which was published last year. But I just want to show you how that would work. So you can ask, the age-old questions are old. The questions are always old, right? It's the answers which may be different in different circumstances. So here's the question. Do we have persistent or growing inequality in this society? Or do we have a tendency towards convergence in this society, right? Are there connections between the initial distribution of wealth and subsequent growth? Is there history dependence in this society, right? So all of you have heard these questions at some point or another, right? Do initial conditions matter, right? This is the same questions, but looked at through the lens of psychology, if you like, how it affects people's goals for the future, right? So as I said, these are old themes in economics. So just to give you an idea on how that theme works, I'm going to skip this slide because I talk about some very standard assumptions on aspirations, but I want to show you how that maps. I'm going to skip that also. Okay, so I'll just talk about this result. So one of the results that you get in
one
this,
clarification.
Yeah, sorry, Obi.
The A star that you derived, beyond which you are, there is frustration, and
Right.
below which you have rising aspiration.
Correct.
Is it an absolute thing
No.
that you're talking about, or is it relative to the wealth?
Relative to the wealth.
Okay.
Right, so, sorry, Obirup, I went through that too quickly maybe. See here, it's the A star that threshold depends on your wealth.
Yeah.
It also, exactly, so it depends on the wealth. Sorry. Okay, so this sort of setup, gives rise to, for example, the following result. It says, if you take this economy and just run it over time, what are you going to get? Well, it turns out that there are only two possibilities in this economy if you run it over time. If you start with a relatively equal initial distribution of wealth, okay, then you get convergence to perfect equality. All relative incomes draw ever closer together, and they grow at a common asymptotic rate, which, let's say, some number G star. But if you start with a distribution of wealth which is actually quite far apart, which is quite unequal to begin with, and this is history, this depends on historical conditions, then the wealth distribution in this model progressively separates into two components. And you get unbounded inequality across these two components. Now, each of these components grows. They grow at different rates, which is why the inequality becomes unbounded. But what's more, which I haven't written down here, is that the rate of growth in this particular case for either component is smaller than the equal rate of growth. So what's interesting about this model is that it generates bifurcations, right? If you start from very initial conditions of quite high equality, then the system will reinforce it. If you start with somewhat high inequality, the system will reinforce that as well. The market is absolutely and implacably indifferent, right, to the cause of convergence or otherwise. You give me some initial inequality, the market is going to back it. So that's the sort of thing that you can do. I'm giving you a very, very quick overview of this with this sort of model if you use it in the context of standard models of economic growth. Maybe something that Amitava Bose would have liked to see in more detail. But what I want to do is, so here's the kind of sort of bimodal distributions that typically emerge from this. So let me, yeah.
So you talked about markets, right? In your model, people invest to meet their aspirations.
Correct.
Okay? Is there part of the model where there is a market out there?
Correct, yes, yeah. So then the equilibrium interest rate is decided endogenously. Yeah, I didn't get into all those details over here, right, exactly. So there's interaction across people. There's interaction, by the way, not just at the market level, which happens in all models, but there's also interaction at the psychological level, right, which is happening because I'm getting influenced by the growing distribution of wealth. Yeah.
One question. The effectiveness of your investment, the effectiveness of the margin, does that depend on your initial stock of wealth? Is there sort of increasing returns to investment?
No. The reason of course one could put that in, and the reason I don't
Richer people are marginally more effective.
Of course, but if you put that in, we all know that general setup, where you have increasing returns, right? If you have increasing returns, the question is, can richer people earn a higher rate of return on their wealth? And the answer is, if yes, we know that generates inequality, okay? So we already know the answer to that question. So the whole name of the game here, again, this is an exercise in modeling. What you want to do is you want to take that effect out.
So you have taken that out?
Absolutely, I've taken that effect out and I'm showing this whiteboard. But in a standard model, in a standard solo type model, you don't get convergence. So just to summarize so far very quickly, so I've just talked about a very simple theory of aspirations formation. I've emphasized the social foundations of these aspirations. I've related to the aspirations to investment and growth, and I've said that such behavior can be aggregated, thus closing the model. But what I want to do in the rest of this talk, I want to take this in a slightly different direction. Just to show you that the setup can be applied elsewhere. Now, as I said, the central feature of this that aspirations can both incentivize or they can frustrate, right? And we can take this notion to other situations. So what I want to do in the rest of this talk, I want to say a few words about the notion of not just private investments, but also collective action. Okay? So I want to think of a multidimensional situation, for example, where part of my persona wants a better life for my children or for my future son, and part of my persona may also participate in activities which are geared to generating dominance over another group, maybe in a social sense. So I want to think of these multidimensional activities.
Debraj, you have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, very good. So, so this is the kind of setup that one can complete, right? So this collective action can be of two kinds: for promoting the self-interest of my group, or for attacking other groups based on class, religion, ethnicity, immigrant statuses. And so I'm going to, because I have limited time, I'm going to just summarize. So here's a very simple model. In this model, what happens is that I again have consumption, just as I had before. I have investments to generate future wealth, just as I had before. But I also have the fraction of the time that I spend in collective action, let's say in engaging in conflict or engaging in violence. Now here there's a very interesting, there's a very interesting story that that actually inspired my work here, and I talked about it recently. Some of the people were there. IIM Calcutta. It's based on the work of Oendrila Dube and Juan Vargas, right? Who studied two changes in resources in Colombia. So Colombia is a major oil exporter, and Colombia is a major coffee exporter. Now it turns out that in Colombia, when oil prices go up, so that Colombia becomes more resource rich, the amount of violence in Colombia actually goes up. When coffee prices go up, again, Colombia is coffee rich, right? Violence comes down. Now, this is a very interesting empirical finding. This was published in the Review of Economic Studies a few years ago, which has, if you think about it, it has a very simple and intuitive explanation. And the explanation is that if you think of any resource in your country, right, getting more plentiful or getting more valuable, it has two effects. One is that the resource is something that you want to grab in collective action. If you're engaged in a war between the paramilitaries and the guerrillas, then you want to grab that resource. The other is that that resource may actually increase the opportunity cost of you engaging in violence. Now, in the case of oil, which is supremely capital intensive, nobody's employed in the oil industry except maybe 20 people, right? The grabbing effect dominates. In the case of coffee, where everybody is employed in coffee, right? When there's a coffee boom, the price of coffee goes up, right? Wages go up. The opportunity cost of engaging in violence goes up. And as a result, nobody wants to become a guerrilla. Nobody wants to actually go out into the streets and engage in collective action. So you get this very disparate reactions, right, on one to the other. And what I want to do is I want to apply that to this context, okay? And instead of coffee or instead of oil, I want to think of two groups. Think of two religious groups, right? And you think of what happens when the income of a particular group goes up. So when the income goes up, that's like a prize that the other group might want to grab, maybe out of envy, maybe out of hatred, maybe out of a sense of threat, right? So an increase in a rival's income, right, increases violence directed against that rival, controlling for everything else. But an increase in your own income, in your own group's income, is going to reduce the amount of violence that you engage in because of the coffee effect, right? Because of the opportunity cost effect. It reduces the amount of violence in which you engage vis-a-vis the other, right? So if you think of two groups in society, the effect on violence is ambiguous, right? It depends on which group is the aggressor and which group is the victim. Right? So if the victim group's income goes up, of course, there's no such thing as a victim group and there's no such thing as an aggressor group, right? It's not like we can label groups in this way. But there are aggressors and victims in both groups, right? So if there's a preponderance of aggressors in a group, then an increase in their income will reduce violence. And if there's a preponderance of victims in a particular group, then an increase in their income will increase violence. And I want to end my talk by showing an interesting diagram. Again, I apologize to a couple of people here who have seen this diagram a few weeks ago, but I want to show it to you here, which I want to illustrate with Hindu-Muslim violence. Now, Hindu-Muslim violence is a problem, of course it's a problem, but it's a problem for researchers because there's very little data on Hindu-Muslim violence. Because the government of India does not publish this data, right? They don't publish this information. So, but thanks to the work of Steve Wilkinson and Ashutosh Varshney, we have detailed data running from 1950 to 1995. I can tell you more, I'm out of time, so I can't tell you a lot about the data, which we've extended in my work with Oniman Mitra, who is now one of my students. And what I want to show you is, so how much time do I have? 5 minutes?
10 minutes.
Oh, it's a moving 10 minutes?
We have 30 minutes for your time, so you can go from that.
Okay, but so guys, just I'll be done in the next 5 minutes.
Our aspirations are increasing every day.
So I want to tell you this because I find it interesting. I found it interesting to me as an economist when I started getting into this literature. There's a wonderful ethnographic literature on conflicts of all kinds, but especially on Hindu-Muslim conflict, right? And I put up some references for you, especially one of my favorite writers who died a few years ago, Asghar Ali Engineer, on different kinds of riots and these underlying economic threads, just as in the Wendela Dubey Juan Vargas paper, underlying economic threads that run through riots. It's bewildering though, because there's a whole mass of ethnographic, there's the usual wood for the trees problem. The more detail you get, the less you see the picture, right? But here's a line, for example, that's kind of there in the popular press, right? So here's something like this: if religious zeal is coupled with economic prosperity, as has happened in Meerut, this is what the Meerut writes, it has a multiplying effect on the Hindu psyche. The ferocity with which business establishments have been destroyed in Meerut bears testimony to this observation. Entire rows of shops belonging to Muslims were reduced to ashes, right? Now we can find similar quotes like this, by the way, about Muslim attacks on Hindu property. Right? So it's not like I'm trying to set up one against the other. I'm just saying that the ethnographic literature does talk about the proclivity, about some connection between the economics of the situation and subsequent violence. But that said, here are two leaders in the field. One is Steve Wilkinson and one is Donald Horowitz, saying that, well, despite the disparate impact of riots on Hindus and Muslims, little hard evidence suggests that Hindu merchants and financial interests are fomenting anti-Muslim riots for economic gain. Okay? Or Horowitz says that the role that commercial competition is set to play is said to be a covert behind-the-scenes role, which makes proof or disproof very difficult. Now, what I want to submit to you is that this idea of aspirations, which gives rise to that result that I told you about, gives us a possible inroad into this problem. The question is, we look at groups, Hindu groups, Muslim groups, we look at variations in their income. And we ask the question, do these variations lead to a rise in violence or a fall in violence? Not only then can we say something about the economic connections between incomes and violence, but we can also say something a little bit more provocative, okay, which is about which group is more likely to have the higher percentage of aggressors, right? Because remember that the aggressor group, if a group has a large fraction of aggressors, then an increase in their income is predicted to lead to a decline in violence. Whereas if a group has a larger proportion of victims, then an increase in their income is predicted to have an increase in violence. Okay? So I want to end my talk by just showing you a picture, and then we can take a couple more questions and we'll start. Okay? So this is the picture I want to show you. There's going to be, on this axis, I'm going to plot Muslim incomes or Hindu incomes in India, starting from 1955 and going up to 2010. I've put expenditure here because, as all of you know, the national sample survey.
Income means aggregate per capita.
Per capita. And not only income, unfortunately we don't have income data. This is from the National Sample Survey. So these are expenditure data, which is proxy for income. Okay. In the food analysis, one has to instrument this properly because there are obvious endogeneity concerns. But leaving that out, I just want to show you how. Okay, so that's on this axis. And on this axis, I'm going to put the casualties in Hindu-Muslim violence as recorded by Varshney and Wilkinson. Okay? The casualties are going to be in the 4 years just after the change in these incomes. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at 55 regions of India. So these are going to be 55 regions of India. So you're going to see 55 lines on this diagram. Okay? Each line is going to connect several dots. What are the dots? The dots are going to be the thick rounds of the NSS from 1983 onwards. So 1983, 1987, 1993, and then going on to, there are 2 more rounds that we use, and ending around 2005. Okay? So we're going to connect these dots. We're going to remove time effects, and we're going to remove, so as to detrend the data, and we're going to remove fixed effects by region. So we're only going to see this effect of a change in income on a change in violence. So this is what you see for Muslim incomes. So you see 55 lines here, and I think it's not an exaggeration to say that these lines are generally upward sloping. And quite significantly so. The effects are extremely strong. Okay? So these lines are upward sloping, which suggests that in the data, increases in Muslim per capita income is followed by a rise in violence. Now, we can interpret it as you will, but this is what I want to put up. And this is what you see for Hindu expenditure. In the data, again, when you see a rise in Hindu per capita incomes, is followed by a decline in violence. Now, more provocatively, in the Journal of Political Economy, where we published this, we pushed the idea that there is a Dubey-Vargas kind of effect going on, right? You can think of Hindu incomes going up as the analog of coffee prices going up, raising the per capita costs of engaging in violence. Whereas Muslim incomes going up might be perceived as a threat, much like Asghar Ali engineering talked about. So this I just put up. We can discuss it more, but this is the regression table. Let me close up now. There was one more variation I wanted to talk about, this idea of consolation prizes, but I'll pass on that in the interest of time. So let me just summarize. So I want to say that, this sort of aspirational setup, this very simple model, does give rise, it can be used to make sharp predictions. Those predictions in principle can be taken to the data. So it starts with the idea that individual preferences depend on the lives of others. Aspiration is a simple way of summarizing these interdependencies. It takes in not just the inequality of income and wealth, but the impact of expanding social media, non-economic markers for delineating groups like religion, multiple dimensions of achievement, and it allows for inspiration and frustration in one setting. Okay? And I wanted to say that aspirations can be used to study a number of different topics: poverty traps, growth and inequality, stuff that I've already talked about. I'm sorry I went over. I tried to compress it a little bit, but I hope this was okay. So I'll stop here.